So in the first part of the discussion on the historical context of contemporary international relations, we examined the earliest discussions about international relations, where we sort of formed these ideas, and we highlighted, for example, the Peloponnesian War coming through other scholars, for example, the Middle Ages and so on. And so in this part, we shall continue to examine other concepts that have come up, the progressive development of international relations through, for example, the 19th century, the 20th century, and some of the outcomes that we have seen. We did talk about the post-Napoleonic War, but especially the Napoleonic Wars, and how Napoleon changed how wars were waged. For example, his invasion of Russia with almost 500,000 troops, but how most of his troops end up almost starving to death, actually kind of starving to death because of the scorched earth policy, where and we actually see this during the Second World War, where the Russians destroy everything so that they denied the enemy of resources. The final battle of Waterloo, Napoleon's exile to the island of Elba, and then his attempt, actually his success in coming back and ruling for about 111 days during the meeting of the Concert of Europe, and then his exile to West Africa. And so the period following the Napoleonic Wars, we see the concept of the balance of power, so where no one nation is so powerful that it threatens other nations, as Napoleon did, but also alliances, so that it was possible to check other nations in becoming too powerful. And so in terms of definition, the Concert of Europe is the general consensus among great powers of Europe in the 19th century, as I mentioned, to maintain the balance of power, integrity of territorial boundaries, following the Treaty of Westphalia about 200-ish years before that. And there was relative stability in Europe, even though, for example, the European Spring in 1848 saw a lot of internal challenges with the resignations of many leaders, but also there were frequent meetings, more than 30 times before the First World War, ad hoc conferences, but these again were monarchs, and of course there were other reasons why these conferences were called, but also why the Concert of Europe persisted. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with international relations. It's really sometimes about the monarchs coming to each other's aid and making sure that the common people did not do what the French had done, murdering their emperor and his or the king and his wife. But we actually begin to see the development of international relations, ideas, diplomacy, organizations, even though it is true that this did not necessarily include countries like countries in Africa, even when these kind of resembled the countries of Europe. So in fact, later on, we would see the countries of Europe call a conference, Berlin Conference, to divide up Africa and other terra nullius, even though clearly there were people living there, and legitimization of these territorial constraints or territorial conquests. So this was the Concert of Europe. It met quite a number of times, like in Paris, Vienna, Prague, Frankfurt, Berlin, and The Hague, and some of these did actually come out with certain organizations or concepts and ideas and practices. But one of the other things that we see is, and this actually sort of comes out of the Crimean War of 1856 that pits the Ottoman Empire against the Russian Empire, and strangely, because of the claims that Napoleon III, Napoleon Bonaparte's cousin, was making as the protector of all Christians, and alleging that the Ottoman Empire was not respecting agreements to take care of Christians in Palestine and Russia was asserting that it was the defender of all Christians and therefore fighting the Ottoman Empire. Strangely, even though the Europeans were taking apart the Ottoman Empire, on this one war they sided with the Ottoman Empire against Russia. But anyway, so that's kind of the Crimean War of 1856. But as a result of that, this is where we see questions of how to treat people who are fighting, wounded in war. So people who, members of the military, when they were wounded, what was their recourse? How are they going to be treated? And so we see the formation of humanitarian organizations like the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, in 1859. And this actually comes from Henry Dunant's work, the Memory of Solferino, the Battle of Solferino, 1859. And even though we probably have never heard of the Battle of Solferino, he was sort of seeing how the soldiers were being neglected. But also, if you think about the previous wars, really people who were fighting in wars did not have recourse to any health, access to health, and so on. And so this was quite the challenge. But ultimately, when we see about 20-something, I think, countries meet in Geneva in Switzerland, they come up with strategies to deal with the wounded, but also they begin to form organizations that would administer various new technologies that crossed borders. So for example, International Telegraphic Union, Postal Union, not sure if these days we send letters, but if you ever sent a letter to a different country, how do you know it's going to get there? If you're buying something from Europe, how much do you know it weighs, and is there pound, or if you're using kilos in Europe and pounds here, how do we know what pounds convert to what kilos? And so these are almost benign ways of thinking about the need for international organizations that regulate commerce. But perhaps the most important is, if you've ever flown, for example, from the US to Europe, how do pilots know what flight levels to follow, or do they just go wherever they want? Now, the answer is that they do not. So there's these organizations that were formed in order to try and help do that. But again, so the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, we see colonialism beginning to rise, European colonial powers. And when we sort of think about colonialism and imperialism, often used interchangeably. And so when we think about imperialism, which is annexation of distant territory and its inhabitants, often by force, actually mostly by force. But when we see the settling of those people, this is really colonialism. So colonialism is settling plus imperialism, and there are good questions over, who is an imperialist and who is not. For example, can we say that the US is an imperial nation, or maybe a benign, expansive power, even though I don't think that there's any such thing? And so when we think about why imperialism occurs, we think about economic gains, new markets, raw materials, but especially for Europeans, they had this idea of the three C's or the three G's: God, glory, and gold, or Christianity, civilization, and commerce. But especially these are driven by industrialization, the need for raw materials, but also the big glory that you own territory somewhere else. And so this was especially accomplished by the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, which actually the US attended but declined to have colonies. I guess they were fed up with the black people that the US had already. But anyway, so Britain was one of the most successful imperial powers. There was this phrase that the sun never set on the British Empire, and this is part of why. But so by the end of the 18th century, about 95%, 85% of Africa was under control of European states. And you also see in Asia, it's only Japan and Thailand that were not influenced by European colonialism and or imperialism. And most European countries actually maintained colonial territories, and this wouldn't be given up until late in the um, late in the 20th century, so 1960s and so on. And of course, they say they were doing a good thing. So when we are approaching the 20th century in international relations, we have to think about before the First World War. And so this a period of peace in Europe that often is called Pax Britannica, from about 1815 to about 1914 when the First World War begins. And so this was a period of domination by Europe, and then after 1914 the US begins to rise, becomes one of the most significant powers in terms of control and economy and influence, even though it was maybe a little isolationist. But so we sort of think about the systems that have defined the 20th century, including the interwar period, so the 20 years between 1918 and 1938, 39, which some people call a break. So it's, you know, like when you're playing sports and you take a break. And so then there was a Cold War period after the Second World War, and now we think about the newer systems. So for example, the zones of chaos, globalization, definition of this period by, for example, the clash of civilizations. According to Fukuyama, the end of history, that was supposed to be 1993, and conflict was supposed to end, but that apparently didn't happen. The peace of the European peace, the past about 80 years when Europeans have been at peace, which is probably the longest period of time that Europeans have not been fighting each other. They kind of really do love to fight each other. Now, of course, as I mentioned, there was, you know, imperialism and the idea that European powers were bringing civilization and prosperity to these backward places, and nothing probably says that more than this depiction. But also, if you sort of think about parallels and similarities, think about the westward expansion of the United States. And so, yeah, you can sort of see how the French are depicting the bringing civilization and wealth and abundance and to the natives who are, uncivilized. And that is not something we should actually, that's not a phrase we should use. In terms of globally, if you think about who was colonized, so from about 1500 to 1960, even though I think the real meaning of colonialism in the contemporary uses doesn't necessarily include the Americas. It's more like, but I think you can see why that is the case, particularly because, you know, it's moving the indigenous peoples out and populating the areas with other, shall we call them, new people. And so there's the first phase of territorial occupation, like the New Spain in the Western world, Australia. But the 20th century and 19th and 20th century colonization was particularly predominantly in Africa and parts of the Middle East and southern parts of Asia. And so this is what comes to an end in the 1960s. So again, we move from balance of power to the period of emergence of hegemonic blocs, emergence of countries like the United States, but also with these colonies we see quite a bit of resistance, and it's possible that we shall be talking about some of this. Now, when we sort of think about the definition of the balance of power, it's the idea of the posture and policy by a group of nations to protect itself or themselves through matching or exceeding power of another state. And so if you sort of think about how this is accomplished, it's increasing own power through the arms race, acquisition of territory, consolidating power with other nations and alliances. And it is thought to have limiting benefits to intrastate war, even though it is not necessary, maybe interstate war between states, preventing the breakup of states, preventing genocide. It's not necessarily clear that if preventing genocide would have been a measure that was necessarily accomplished. And so it is seen particularly in 1814 and 1914 as when the limiting of conflict was particularly poignant. And, the British and the Americans had significant power. Now, there's questions of whether states prefer peace, particularly if you think about anarchy. And so there's really calculations that states will do, and there will be times that they fight and there are other times that they will not fight. And so if they know, or if their power is symmetrical, they probably won't fight. And so if you think about the current or recent wars like Russia and Ukraine, Russia clearly thought that it was probably going to win over Ukraine. And now we see that hasn't necessarily happened within the first 2 years. And so again, how do we measure the capacity of nations to fight? But also we have to think about who fights and who is on their side. Even though in the particular case of Russia and Ukraine, we really can't talk about hegemons, even though maybe the US is a hegemon, but it's not in that war specifically. But wherever there's a hegemon, political scientists think that there's less likelihood of there are very few states that will try to fight a hegemon, because the theory is that they are going to lose, and states kind of don't like to lose. So balance of power is simple, because if you think about like NATO, if you have an alliance that will come to your defense, nobody wants to fight the whole of NATO, and so that is probably an asymmetrical power relationship, and there's probably going to be less likelihood of a fight. So, but we also have to, I think, keep in mind the notion that European solidarity was driven by the idea of Christian civilized white nations, but also by elites who had seen the Napoleonic War, well, the French Revolution and other revolutions, and even including Haiti. And so it's almost like Europeans had to find something else to occupy, expand outside of Europe rather than within Europe. And so relative peace to Europe, but relative chaos and death and genocides to other places. Even though it was also challenged. So for example, Russia and Turkey and the Ottoman Empire, really, the triple alliances. But so again, if you think about alliances, sometimes alliances are formed in order to help nations and states to be powerful enough so that they can keep other nations away from them. And so this is really, I think, an important question. Now, the First World War really marked the collapse of the balance of power system. Part of this was Germany's rise, consolidation and destabilization of the balance, and the defeat of the French during the Franco-Prussian War. But also when we think about alliances, and some arguments about this have been made, whether the US should defend all NATO allies. But so the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the alliances that existed then kind of are seen as the ones that precipitated the First World War. And so this was a local war. It escalated into continental in later World War, and the different casualties, the counts up to 37 million, as some believe, but also the introduction of new weapons like the airplane, submarine warfare, chemical warfare. And so when we think about the alliances that existed then, we can sort of see how they led to perhaps the one of the worst conflicts in history until the next conflict. And so, but again, when we think about Britain and France and primarily European powers, they were weakened by this war. And the question is was this a good thing? Maybe. So the First World War saw the collapse of three empires, but also, for example, Russia, the revolution, Austria-Hungary was dismembered, the Ottoman Empire was dismembered, but the Ottoman Empire was already coming apart long before this. So, for example, 1832 with the Greeks gaining independence and so on. But especially there's many reasons for the First World War, including nationalism and colonial possessions and cousins and other things. But also the First World War settlements almost necessarily made the Second World War inevitable because of the German dissatisfaction with the humiliation of Versailles. And so actually some refer to it as the humiliation of Versailles, or the Germans called the dictated peace. And so we obviously know we are familiar with the rise of National Socialism, fascism in Italy and Japan, in Germany, Mussolini, Japanese Empire, in particular Hitler. And even the organization that was put in place to perhaps manage peace was weak, and it did nothing about Japanese aggressions in China, Italian invasions in Ethiopia and Libya, German aggression in what was often known as the unification. I forget the German word. Anschluss. The union of Germany and Austria, but also the German expansion into Prussia and other territories, and what outcomes this brought about. And so what was the League of Nations going to do? And so these settlements almost necessarily brought about the Second World War, but also, again, the question of when the Second World War begins, some people will say it's as soon as the First World War ended, the settlements and so on. Others will say it's Japan's invasion of China, first by creating Manchukuo in northeast China in 1928-29, and then in 1937 with the invasion of Nanking and the massacre there. But others will also say that maybe it's Italy's invasion of Abyssinia and the fact that the League of Nations did nothing. But again, you think about Hitler and really his goal of 1,000 years Reich that really lasted 12 years, fascism, mobilization of the masses in support of the state, and sort of the characteristics of fascism, the ideas of exalting the nation and race above individuals, the idea of superior civilizations. But so we have to sort of think about these particularly three trends in supremacist nationalism and sort of their expansionism and conquest, and how they contribute to the Second World War. Now, in many instances and places, you will hear about the Munich appeasement and how, for example, British Prime Minister appeased Germany, but other interpretations have suggested that Neville Chamberlain, other interpretations will suggest that Chamberlain was actually buying time. So the idea of sacrificing Czechoslovakia to avoid a general war, the Anschluss with Austria, but especially the Munich appeasement, the idea that Germany was not ready for, Britain was not ready for a war, and therefore what Chamberlain was doing was buying time. Now, there's much to say about the Second World War, and we probably shall talk about wars during the discussion on wars, conflicts, but we actually see, for example, massive human rights violations, genocides, rape, and other criminal activity. but also the creation of the Geneva Conventions that supplemented the Hague Conventions of 1907 and 1899 on how you treat individuals, whether they are combatants, non-combatants, prisoners of war, and so on. We also see other things, for example, during the Second World War, the use of nuclear weapons, the decline of Europe in global importance, and it's replaced by the US and USSR, even though the thinking was that if there was going to be another world war, it would begin in Europe or be fought in Europe. But almost about 15 years after the end of the Second World War, we actually see the redistribution of power, but there also the end of colonialism. So particularly USSR was vitally concerned. Maybe it wasn't concerned, but it made the point to point out that the US was holding its black citizens in second-class status, but also called out America's allies because they were colonial powers. Now you are familiar with the death camps and the work camps and so on, and you saw these are some of the outcomes of the Second World War. But punishments for these outcomes would be seen, for example, in the Nuremberg trials, the Tokyo trials, and so the Geneva Conventions actually kind of helped to solidify the need to make sure that this didn't happen. Well, until Rwanda and maybe until the Great Lakes region and the Second Congo War, and also Yugoslavia when it was breaking up, and maybe now with Ukraine. So yeah, but we want to sort of think about the Second World War coming to an end, and these are, I think, important maps. So that was Germany. This is what Japan controlled. Japan actually had a very interesting argument, and they say that they were creating the greater Asia co-prosperity sphere, and that they were kicking out the European imperialists, but it is argued that in most instances, their control of East Asia was probably worse than colonial control. Obviously, we all remember that the end of the Second World War was hastened, if not brought about, by the atomic weapon. And you will hear that the good guys won, and they did maybe, but they still supported colonialism and other terrible things. And so when we sort of think about the Second World War, there were significant deaths in some areas. And so we actually see quite a bit of genocides, mass murder of human beings, particularly Jews and other minorities that are thought to be, but not even minorities, like communists who are not necessarily minorities. It's a political ideology, LGBTQ individuals, people with genetic defects, and eventually black people. And so we have to sort of think about the human condition and what was thought to be achieved, accomplished by these policies. Now, of course, the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, there are many questions about its use and whether targeting civilians was necessary and proper. Even though in other places I have argued that when we think about sovereignty, or maybe sovereign responsibility, as I argue, if you're benefiting from the things that your country is doing, so for example Germany, are you not complicit with that regime? Can you suggest that you had no part of it and therefore you should be exempt, even though you are benefiting from the benefits? And so these are, I think, questions to continue to ask. But perhaps what we ought to think about is the end of the Second World War and what comes after. And so this is where we meet the successor organization to the League of Nations, which failed spectacularly. And the successor nation was the League of Nations.